checking my waves are bigger than yours. Hello, welcome to the Mr. Feels podcast, episode 1. I am pumped, and I am also your host, Tyler May.
And I'm your other host, Laura Benson.
Yeah, I guess we're co-hosting this, and this episode is all about a dope mental illness, right, Laura?
Dope.
We both have a mental illness called bipolar. And not only bipolar, what type of bipolar, Laura?
Bipolar 2.
And there's two of us. So what does that say? And means two.
There we go.
What I want to do with this podcast is just basically give an avenue for people to talk about their own mental illness and kind of erase some of the stigma surrounding mental illness, and also educate people about illnesses and disorders that they're just not familiar with, and be able to be not only educated on it, but be able to understand it better, and also to empathize with people who haven't have it, or because they haven't experienced it. I know that I have not experienced a lot of mental illnesses, and so when I listen to other people talk about their own experiences, it just gives me a lot more understanding, perspective, and empathy. So that's why I'm just super passionate about this project, because it means a lot to me.
Yeah. And I think another intention with this podcast is also just to open the conversation. It can be really isolating and really scary to be diagnosed with mental illness and to navigate that on your own. And, connecting to our story with Tyler and I, we're colleagues, and we found out that we're both bipolar too. Mm-hmm. And we've had very different experiences, but a lot of commonalities throughout our journeys. And by, being vulnerable and opening up a little bit in the workplace and talking about something that feels really uncomfortable to talk about publicly, we made this great connection, and, we're able to support ourselves and one another. And that's another thing that we really strive for with this podcast.
Yeah. And with bipolar or most mental illnesses, as you were talking about, in isolation. And I remember feeling the feeling of just being completely alone and hopeless for extended amounts of time.
Right.
And I just didn't talk to people about it because I didn't think that anyone could possibly understand what I was going through, even though there was a part of my brain that knew that was wrong, but the majority of my brain just accepted a lie. And it's crazy sad how we can trick ourselves into feeling that there's no hope and we're completely alone. So I want to use this podcast as an avenue to not only spread empathy, understanding, and education, but to be able to help others feel a little less alone.
Right.
So yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Let's get into bipolar, I guess. So, Laura, do you want to describe what bipolar is, specifically bipolar 2?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two classifications of bipolar disorder. It used to be called manic depressive and has since shifted from that terminology. But basically, when one is bipolar 2, they experience more extreme highs and manic episodes and more extreme lows and depressive episodes than most people do. Basically, the way that I think about it is that, human emotion exists on a spectrum, and we all have highs and lows, and we're kind of on this pendulum swing. But if you're bipolar, that pendulum swings to much more extreme degrees, and you can experience mania that takes you almost completely out of normal experience into what's called delusional experience. And you get really hyper, you don't sleep, you can have really erratic thoughts, hyper anxiety. It can be actually very inspirational also. I kind of like being manic. A lot of people who
everybody gets if people who have mania, you get addicted to it. People don't sleep. You just cannot sleep. People you cannot sleep for weeks, and
right.
you can you're so hyper focused.
Right.
Mania is great, but then it also ruins a lot of relationships.
Absolutely. It can be it's a very euphoric time. Yeah. And you're not necessarily thinking in a logical way. And then the opposite of mania, usually people will swing back down. Mm-hmm. The pendulum always swings back, and you'll experience depression. And depression, is often accompanied with lethargy, loss of desire or motivation or, engagement, things won't taste as good. Like you'll lose a sense of joy and just be lost in this like deep sadness. And so people who are bipolar will experience both of those usually within a course of months or a few weeks, depending on how rapid their episodes are.
Yeah, I feel like that's a pretty great definition and description of bipolar.
Right.
You used it as like a pendulum swinging. The illustration that like most people give is kind of like it's a big roller coaster ride of just like your emotions are up and down all the time.
Yeah.
People use that as a saying, but I think of it more. I found a great analogy of instead of a roller coaster, it's more like one of those drop tower rides where it just takes you from like 200 feet in the air down to like 5 feet and then back up and then incredible and just like shifting you around all over crazy like. And so I feel like that's the most accurate description that I can like frame in my head.
Right.
So if that helps you kind of figure out what more bipolar is,
Right.
then yeah.
And also bipolar 2, which I did not mention yet, is it's sort of just a less extreme degree. Usually people who are bipolar 2 will tend more towards the depression side and less towards the mania. So while someone who's bipolar 1 will experience extreme manic episodes that might land them in the hospital or really put them out of touch with reality, people who are bipolar 2 will experience what's called hypomania, which is less extreme. So they don't fully lose touch with reality, but then they'll swing more completely into the depression side and usually stay there a little bit longer.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest differences between Laura and I, whereas I'm more geared towards the depression side, and like that's just like my natural disposition is to be a sad, depressed, emotional boy. And so I have to fight that and use medication for that in general, and also to like balance that with bipolar. And so that I have that because I'm bipolar, but that's just where I'm coming from, and I'm trying to get to like equilibrium at like emotionally in my brain, whereas you're more like tempted towards like the mania side and like overreacting, right?
Right. Yeah, I tend to, and I've definitely experienced a decent amount of depression throughout my life. But I do tend towards mixed episodes. So if which means that I'm kind of experiencing mania and depression simultaneously, which is just like everything is negative and everything is wrong, but I'm really agitated. And so sometimes I have energy, even if I'm experiencing negative cyclical thinking.
I have that, but like on the opposite side, like where, you know how when you're manic and like you just get like super hyper focused and like you're like in the zone and motivated to do like whatever you're doing right now. I have that sometimes when I'm depressed, like I'm super sad, but if I get in the gear where I can have that mania in depression almost. It's maybe that's not the right like overlap, but my therapist said something that made it. She's a therapist and a trained doctor, so she knows a lot more about it. So she could talk more about that. And that leads me to give you the preface that both of us are not doctors and both of us only know our own experiences. So we're just here to share our stories and to tell you what that's like and to give you a little understanding there. And we can't help you figure out like what is happening in you. If you're struggling at all with this, or you think that you're having the same symptoms as bipolar, maybe I'd recommend going to a doctor and not like emailing a bunch of people and trying to get help from people who don't really know what they're talking about, which is us.
Right.
Yeah. So I want to kind of go into our stories because you talked about like having that mixed like mania and a lot of different episodes, right? And so do you want to just take us through like how you came to figure out that you had bipolar?
Sure. So I think the first episode that I had that would be classified as an episode was actually my first week of college. So I was 18 years old and I moved down to Los Angeles. I'm originally from the Bay Area. And I had a manic episode like my second week of college because I was in this new environment. Everything was amazing. Like college is so cool. You know, you're in dorms, you're by yourself for the first time, living independently. There's so much inspiration everywhere. And I just felt like colors were more vivid and food tasted better. I lost my appetite. I actually was so hyperactive during that time that I lost like 15 pounds in 2 or 3 weeks. Because I was just constantly going and my metabolism was like jacked way up, and I didn't sleep. I didn't really feel the need to sleep. I was, like having these really insane euphoric experiences, looking at art and just really hyperstimulated. Yeah. And I had so much energy and I felt so incredible. And
how much were you sleeping at those
I
times?
wasn't really sleeping. I would lay down in my bed and just kind of listen to music for a few hours and like meditate. And then I'd wake up and I would feel, or, get out of bed at 6 a.m. or whatever. And I would feel energized. Yeah. Like I didn't feel like I needed to rest. But then, on the opposite end of that, like a few weeks or a couple months later, I had my first dip. And since I was at school for the first time, there's this whole kind of cultural dialogue that like when you move to college, you have a high and then inevitably you'll have a low. Like there's all these articles written about it. And so it felt like the natural progression of what it is to just go to school. So I didn't think anything of it really. But that was my first sign, and another indicator actually during that episode that I didn't mention is that I was speaking really rapidly. And my sister mentioned that to me. Like she would get on the phone to try to have a conversation with me and I would just be talking in spits. Yeah. And, but nobody in my family really had a frame of reference. We didn't have a family history of mental illness really. And so we hadn't thought about that being something that happened. It was just this normal experience for an 18-year-old. So anyway, so that happened. And then, things kind of became normal. And then when after I graduated school, I think that I continued to have cycles, like every 4 to 6 months, I would kind of experience these high and lows. And, but I didn't really think very much of it because when you're living in the semester pattern, like it just sort of happens naturally. And then I moved abroad and, continued to just kind of deal with it on my own. I feel like I felt really deeply, but I wasn't looking for, like I said, the pattern of being bipolar. And then I moved around a lot, actually, and that led to, but I would make these decisions kind of on the fly. And that's something that's also I've learned as an indicator that like maybe you have something going on. If every 3 or 4 months or 6 months, you all of a sudden are like super inspired to move to LA, and then you move to LA and you have $500 in your pocket and you just make it work, So
do you think like being in a new environment or the desire to move is a trigger for you and your mania?
Right. I think it's both. Okay. I think so. One thing that I've learned about bipolar is that when you're hypomanic, you don't necessarily logically weigh things. You kind of live in a dream.
Very impulsive.
And you make very impulsive decisions. And I essentially did that my entire early 20s. And it was really hard for me because I would just make this decision. I would move really fast and then I would get there and I would deal with the low and I would spend 2.5 weeks crying. And it was this thing that I could actually feel coming on. By the time I was 23, I recognized, like I could recognize a few weeks out when I was going to have a depression, but I still hadn't reached out to anyone about it. I didn't get it classified.
At 23, you didn't reach out to anybody about, and you had this like at 18.
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah. But it wasn't ever bad enough. Okay. It felt, like I said, I moved around a lot. And so it felt kind of like part of the natural progression of things. But I would feel like the depression coming on kind of like a wave. Like I would know that inevitably I was going to swing down. So I had to get all of this stuff done so that I could lock myself in my room for 5 days and just cry. And it went unnoticed because I was experiencing the world and moving around. And I think that's something that's really encouraged in our generation. And so it went, like undiagnosed for a long time. And then when I was living in Los Angeles, and I was 25 and I was working in the film industry, which is a very high stress, movement oriented industry. And I basically just wore myself down over the course of a year to such an extent that I was like, I call it mixed manic depressive for about 2 months. And that was when I really broke, and came home and got diagnosed and started getting help, getting therapy, and I was put on medication. But basically what happened is I had a psychotic episode, I had a psychotic break is what they call it. And everything was negative, like everything was wrong. And all of my thoughts were directed towards myself. I couldn't sleep. I had terrible insomnia, and I would just like text my friends compulsively about everything being wrong, but in really unhealthy ways. And they would, kind of try to be present for me, but didn't really know what to do. And I wasn't reaching out to anyone in my immediate environment. I was just reaching out to people who I couldn't actually physically be in contact with.
Who couldn't help you.
And who couldn't help me, exactly. And the thing that actually finally kind of led me into this like breaking point is that I moved. While I was moving, I crashed my car. Is LA, so it's just a fender bender, but and I lost my cell phone, and what else? Something else happened that week, but all of this stuff happened all at once. And so I was living in this new environment. I felt like things were really spinning out of control, and I just couldn't get myself back into a centered space. And so I started taking it out on myself physically in these really weird ways, and it just like I would like punch my legs, because I was frustrated. Like it felt like I was having a tantrum, like a 5-year-old. So anyway, and then my family came to see me, and when they saw what was going on, they grabbed me and they took me home.
I feel like a lot of people don't know what like a psychotic episode is like.
Right.
And I don't think I ever had like a huge psychotic episode. I know I've had a couple like breakdowns where like I've gotten severely angry in hypomanic states, but I don't think I've ever like been so out of my mind. Like there was always a very well thought out reason why I was acting the way I was, but it was just heightened 1,000%.
Right.
So can you go into detail more like about the psychotic episodes, or is that pretty much it?
Yeah, it's hard to describe, I do feel like there were a couple weeks during that time that are sort of blacked out for me, to be honest. As I've learned more about the brain and the way that it works, I've learned that actually the parts of the brain that are affected by bipolar are the memory centers and the anxiety and trauma centers. And so when I sort of emerged from this and started getting help and went on medication, there were like swaths of time that I just didn't remember, or I couldn't recall details. And part of that is because my brain was essentially experiencing trauma in its memory centers. But how do I describe it? It was really odd because I was functioning fine at work, but then I would get into my car, which was a safe space for myself, and I was alone. And I would scream uncontrollably, and I actually developed what's called depression-induced Tourette's.
I've got that too.
I'm not sure this is very many people, but
Did you notice me like twitching like at the desk like a few hours ago?
No.
It happens. Like it still happens. It's weird.
Well, so mine was verbalized. So I actually would yell when I got really deep in it.
Yeah.
Right before my parents came to my rescue. I would like yell into my like shoulder, basically like profanities towards myself, and they'd be like, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, and just repetitive.
Was it conscious like
abuse.
Thought after like running it through your head a bunch, or was it like you couldn't stop like a tick?
I think it was kind of both. Okay. I think that like that negative thought pattern was continually in my brain.
Yeah.
24 hours a day. I was hearing this voice that was just battering me over and over and over again. And
just
then
to be clear,
that's
not like an outside voice. That's more like bipolar 1, where like you can start to hear like voices, but that's more of just like your internalized personal like
this
voice.
Was my internal narrative, which everybody has all the time. But sometimes they just turn really vicious.
Because we're jerks.
Because we're mean to ourselves. That's a whole thing. We're so mean to ourselves. But yeah, so it went from that, and then I externalized it, and it was a really dark time. And like I said, the insomnia and the kind of inability to hold conversation and the focus on everything that was wrong, that was a big part of the what I would call the psychotic episode.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, and so bipolar basically, if in a sense like ruined your LA career in the film industry. Well, it didn't like ruin it completely, but like at the time, did you feel like your life was breaking down because you had to go all the way back home? And like, how was that experience like personally?
Yeah, I really resisted it. I mean, I knew that I had to leave. Like, I knew that I couldn't function in Los Angeles anymore, and living on my own. And so I was ready. Like, I feel like I felt physically depleted and emotionally, psychologically, I'd been defeating myself for months. So I was ready for help from my parents. And initially, I mean, the plan wasn't for me to move home necessarily, but they came and got me. And initially, the plan was just to go home and get help, see a psychiatrist, talk to a therapist, and kind of see where I was at. And then when I went home, I saw a couple of psychiatrists and doctors, and they classified me as bipolar 2, and they were like, you need to take this seriously. Your full-time job right now should be recovery, because it can be a really trying process. Mm-hmm. And so then we made the decision for me to move home. And yeah, I mean, it was really hard. It was really hard for me. I moved back in with my parents. Yeah. But it had reached such a point where it felt like it was either check into a facility or be at home. And my folks were really wanting me to be home. Yeah. And it felt like a relief. Like going and getting this diagnosis was a relief for me, because it kind of gave me a context. Like I had had a feeling for years that I was bipolar.
Really?
Yeah. I kind of knew. And so
did anybody like call you out on it?
No. Oh, okay. No, because I think that when you're living your experience, like I was able to recognize my patterns, but other people weren't.
And then you had it for so long, so people just thought it was just you. Right?
Yeah, and I was moving, like every 6 months or a year, I would be somewhere else. And so I would have this new group of friends, a new community. And nobody really was in that process with me. Like I'm close to my family, but you can also edit what you share very easily. So getting that diagnosis was kind of a weight off my back. I felt like finally, okay, it gives me this context. I can start understanding it from what I did. Was I started, looking into the neurological part of it.
Finally have this problem that you've identified, so you can attack the problem rather than attacking yourself.
Exactly. Exactly. And so I started getting help, and it was really hard. It was like months of crying and screaming. And I didn't want to get therapy,
Why not?
I don't know. I think that
Did you want to be like independent, or is it more?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there was a big part of me that felt like seeing a therapist was failing somehow.
That's probably just because the stigma surrounding it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that in general, a lot of people have a very hard time with that. And
therapists are rad though. Everyone should have
It was amazing.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
See, I've never talked to somebody who has had like a really bad experience after like finding a good therapist. Like, of course, like it's difficult to find a good one sometimes. Like it took me like the second therapist that I have, like I enjoy. Like we're bros. She's like a 60-some-year-old woman, and she knows a lot about mental illness. So like I highly recommend 10 out of 10, regardless of mental illness or not.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really the thing that beyond medication, I think that talk therapy is what really
and that's
helps
if you
me.
Google like anything about bipolar, like the biggest helper is psychotherapy, which is just like talking about it, which is something that we don't do like as people who are struggling with anything, especially people who are struggling with a mental illness. We don't want to talk about ourselves in a negative way, and we also don't want to like show people that we're struggling.
Right.
Yeah.
Admitting that was hard.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Man, you have any more of that story? That's a good story. Well told.
No, I mean, that's the onset. I can talk more about the help that I got and that whole process.
Yeah, it took you quite a while, right?
It did. I went the route of trying medication, and fortunately, I was living with my family, so I was in a really stable environment. Yeah. And that did create. Yeah.
Same. I had the same thing. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, I mean, it created a degree of stress in its own.
Yeah.
Right? Like being with your parents is, they're so emotionally invested that it was really hard for my parents to process and to go through. And when I was in
like
my
they
room,
don't understand it, so it's like a whole thing. It's almost like they have to deal with a mental illness as well. 'Cause
Right.
It's almost as hard on them as it is for us. And like I think it was harder on my mom than it was on me. Like I feel so bad for like how I reacted, and like you with even more manic episodes. Like we did so much crap to our parents.
Yeah.
So, oh man.
yeah, I mean, I know that my mom felt like she'd failed.
Oh man.
Right. Like that was something that she really took on. She's a very sensitive person. And so it's taken a couple of years for us to get to the point where we know that if I'm crying in my room, it's not her fault.
Yeah.
Right. Because as a mother, like that's your role and you want to protect your child. And that's something that I think is so important for people to understand, especially around mental illness, is that it is a chemical process that's happening in your brain, and it is not the fault of you or anybody else in your life. It can be triggered by other people in your life, and it can be triggered by experiences that you have, but it's not their fault.
Yeah.
You know,
The biggest comfort that I ever had was like after a couple months of having or like knowing that I was bipolar and going through manic episodes and figuring out medication and being imbalanced and struggling so much and losing friends and wondering like who I even was as a person. I was just explaining this whole like thing to somebody else, and just to hear the words, "It's not your fault."
right.
Oh, just such a weight like off your shoulders. It's just to know that a problem, or not even one problem, but a series of problems, the biggest problems that I've ever struggled with in my entire life aren't myself, and is a mental illness called bipolar. And so I can target that and know that it's not my fault, and know that like there's help to be there.
Right.
Oh, it's so great, man.
Right. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience?
Sure. My experience is it starts out more on the depression side. So like everything, I feel like yours always goes up and mine always goes down. It was interesting to hear about like going and cry. You talk a lot about like going, like I just need to cry for like a week or something.
Right.
Did you ever get to the point where like you were so depressed that you couldn't like cry, and it was just like past that?
I did.
Okay. What was
Yeah.
like, all right, before I talk about myself, I want to
That's
hear
the worst.
what's the lowest point you ever hit?
I
I hit a lot of low points. I'll get to it.
and I did have a lot of low points. I feel like,
Do you have like one specific instant?
yeah.
Yes.
I-
Give it to me.
mean-
I feel bad for getting excited about this,
No.
but I know my low is probably, I know my low is lower than yours. So
Yeah. I mean, so in general,
let me just go back to
What?
I just realized how like douchey that sounded. I'm like my low
You can
is
edit
lower
that
than
out.
yours. Oh, I'm so superior with my mental illness that's more valid than yours.
just cut it out
All
and
right,
post it.
all right, I'm in timeout. You can continue talking.
Yeah. So I think in general, depression is this, like I said, just it feels like this blanket of fog kind of settling in, and that's what's really scary about it. Is like crying sucks, being sad sucks, but it's still an emotion.
Yeah.
And sometimes I would get to this point of just like nothing matters. You know, F it, nothing's important. Ugh, I don't even need to eat. I don't need to get out of bed.
Yeah,
There's no
yeah.
point. And it's so interesting recalling that time, because it feels like I think about it in my memory and it just feels dark. Like
Yeah,
I just
like
experienced
you-
this black image.
Exactly.
But I think so my lowest point, or one of my lowest points, it was actually probably one of my biggest breakthrough moments. I remember, I don't know exactly how long I'd been home, but I was at home at some point, probably a few months after moving back from Los Angeles. And I was in my room and I was just sobbing, like just completely despairing and destitute. And I remember like looking up, I opened my eyes, and it was evening. I opened my eyes and I looked up on my ceiling, and I like saw, I'm going to sound so crazy. I saw my depression. Like it was this external image of this shadow figure. Right. And I looked at this thing and I was like, fuck you. I don't know if I can say that. You can
say
beep
whatever
it
you
out
want.
if you want to, but I just got so angry. And it was the first time that I realized, this was actually probably about 6 months after I moved home, that I like saw it as an external thing. And it was a part of me, but it wasn't all of me. It was actually probably more of a breakthrough than a low point, but that's okay. I'll tell the story anyway. Cool.
Not a lot of people have that experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was actually when things shifted because I'd been in such a dark place. I hadn't wanted to go anywhere. I mean, my sister would literally like pull me out of bed and take me on a walk every day so that I got out. Okay. Because I couldn't really make eye contact with people. I didn't want to make eye contact with people. I would just look down at the ground. I didn't want to connect with anybody. But in this moment of like lying in my bed and like, you know, seeing this creepy, awful shadow figure outside of myself, I just realized like, you can't win. And it had been winning for a long time. So that's actually, like I said, it's probably more of a breakthrough than a low point, but it was in the middle. Comes from the low point. But it was in the middle of this just like deep despairing place where I'd pretty much lost hope.
And the darkest point is where the light shines through the most. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was a really interesting experience. So do you want to talk a bit about your experience?
Yeah. So I think it mostly started when I was just finishing up my internship last summer. And on the last day of my internship, which was supposed to be like a celebration, and like they were having like a little mini party, and I was giving like a speech and everything in front of the whole company. But what ended up happening on that day was almost my entire team got laid off on the last day that I was there. Oh, no. And so I was just seeing people that I was the closest to at the company come upstairs one by one with just dejected faces and tears in their eyes and having to say goodbye to them, knowing that I wasn't just like saying goodbye to the company, but when I were to come back, like they just weren't going to be around anymore. So that made me really sad. But I mean, it wasn't unforeseen. So like we all kind of saw that coming. So there was a little bit of good to that, but like I didn't end up feeling any of those feelings because I was going to like Yosemite like a day later. And then after that, I was going back home to relax for like a week. And then after that, I was going to see my girlfriend who I haven't seen in 3 months. So like, I didn't want to feel sad for any of those moments. And so I ended up going back home, have a good time, road tripped all the way there by myself. And then saw my girlfriend for a few days, which was incredible. And then went back to school, which was amazing, getting to see all these friends who I haven't talked to in the past 3 months. And I ended up just having a really good time, kind of put that whole thing behind me, but I never really felt those emotions. And so after a few weeks of just like being at school and getting into the grind, I started feeling more of a disconnect because my major and all the classes in my major I just didn't like anymore. And I was feeling, because I was studying digital media, I'm pretty good at digital media. Like I'm starting a podcast. I do videography and photography. I was teaching my teachers more than they were teaching me, that's for sure. So like I was finding out that like, not only do I not like my classes, I kind of hate my classes.
So do you feel like that came from kind of this delayed feeling of the sadness that you were putting off from before?
I feel like
more
I was kinda,
than your classes themselves?
Because I was just going through college to being like getting through it as a degree. And then I go to Patreon and I'm just like, I'm working for a tech startup in San Francisco. Why the heck am I in a tiny school in Wisconsin that can't teach me anything?
Right.
So like that just added to all of the basically the decline into depression. So I had that, and then my girlfriend and I started talking a little bit less and less just because we both got really busy. And so just like that on top of everything. And then like a week before finals week, we ended up deciding to mutually break it off because of 2 reasons. We both believed different politically, and we were both going into different directions. And so I wanted to like save face. So like I helped us come to that conclusion, and we felt really good about it. But in my deep down in my mind, I knew that was like 100% false, because it wasn't that we disagreed politically. It's that I had just become so depressed that like I just didn't care. Like I was totally apathetic about issues. And not only that, but like we weren't going in different directions. She wasn't headed toward like New York and DC, and I was going to California because I had just lost like any future opportunity, because all the jobs that I could have like gone up the ladder in at the company are not even jobs anymore, because they all got laid off, and that just not, those aren't roles. And so like, I feel like I don't have a future. So I don't have a future. I now don't have a girlfriend. I'm completely apathetic. I hate my major. And now I just have to take finals and go home. So I go home. I usually use those break times to be super creative. Was never super creative. Didn't hang out with anybody. I drove to Nashville for a few days to hang out with some friends I never got to see. We were all just depressed the whole time. It just wasn't, I didn't know what was wrong. And so that's like, as soon as like I got back home, it was a steady, like a severe decline into depression. I was feeling it ever since the end of my summer, but then it just started spiraling from there. And like, I was starting to think, like, having these thoughts of like, how do people even communicate? I couldn't fathom like people answering questions and having conversation. So I would just hold myself up even more because I was just so scared of somebody asking me like a normal question. And I was, not only that, like I remember thinking that like I couldn't even work like a fast food job. Like I would freak out. Like I wouldn't be able to like do that. And if I can't like work a minimum wage job, how could I even survive doing anything? Like I'm unskilled in all these areas, and all of the job experience that I have is just like worthless kind of now.
Okay, so over the course of a few months, it seems like you were continuing to decline and becoming more anxious and isolated and generally negative.
Yeah.
But did it occur to you at any point in that process, oh, I'm sinking into a depression, this is what this is? Or did you have any frame of reference for that yet? Or
that's the problem. It wasn't like I knew of depression. I never thought that I had depression because I thought that was always for the people who had it really bad. And since I'm just like a white suburban kid, like I didn't have depression. I knew about depression a lot, and I was pretty well versed. And so like I knew that people could have that, but I couldn't think of myself as having that. So I just thought that I was incredibly lazy. And so I basically thought that I was a jerk and that I was lazy. So that just perpetuated it and made it worse and worse.
So when did you first discover or think about actually having depression? Like what was the diagnosis process for you, or the discovery process?
So as soon as I got back to school the next semester, I started not being able to do any of the classwork. And the previous semesters, I was getting 4.0s, taking 18 credits, working a part-time job. And this semester, I was only taking like 12 credits at the time, pulling all-nighters on assignments that were taking others an hour or two to complete. So something was wrong. I didn't tell anybody about it until I dropped out of college, like 2 days before I left. And it felt, I mostly dropped out because like I was like, we're only 4 weeks in, but like I'm so far behind, I can't even possibly pass this class at this point. And nobody believed like the severity of it, and except for me. And I was just so far, like I felt trapped. And so I just I just wanted like that confirmation. So I called my parents. I was like, is it like, I can't. And so they're like, maybe you should come home. And so it felt so good to make that decision. I decided to come home. And that was like the only decision that like I had made in the past months. The last decision I made was to break up with a girlfriend over 2 fake reasons. And so packed everything up, was constantly having anxiety and panic attacks, just like walking around the room, like super flustered, not knowing how to think, not knowing what to do. And just like, I can't wait to get home to do nothing. I knew I wasn't going to do anything. I knew I wasn't going to get better, even though I was telling people that I was going to go back and focus on my mental health just because I've heard people say that. All that I could say was nothing unique of my own thoughts, but was only just me regurgitating what I've heard other people say. So I get back home. And once you make that last like decision to like drop out of college and go home, and you're severely depressed, pretty much the only like other choice when you're hopeless and alone is to want to kill yourself. And so for about 2 months, I was suicidal.
While you were at home with your parents?
Yeah. So I holed myself up in a room, only watching movies, shows, subreddits, some things like horrible, some things just like super light and dumb, but absolutely watching anything that would possibly take my mind off of hating myself. Because as soon as I got back, like I wasn't responding to any of my friends' text messages because I felt bad and I didn't want them to think that I was wasting my life or was just lazy and stupid and just a jerk. And so I wouldn't respond to like text messages that were saying things like, hey, I love you, I miss you, and I need one of your hugs. And so I was able to not respond to that which made things worse because I thought that I was like a monster for not responding to that. So constantly for 2 months straight, I would have this thought cycle of, I hate myself. I hate myself because I'm ignoring all of my friends. I'm ignoring all of my friends because I dropped out of college on a whim. I dropped out of college on a whim because I'm super lazy and I hate myself. I hate myself because, and then the cycle just continues over and over again. You get these ruts stuck in your head of thought processes that if you think of long enough that like you just get trapped.
Right. Well, and that's one of the main indicators of depression is that kind of really negative cyclical thinking, that feels impossible to get out of.
Yeah. I had no tools to fight it except for like going to bed at like 6 a.m. and then waking up at like 5 p.m. because and I didn't like shower frequently. I wanted to feel like as bad as I did on the inside, on the outside. So like it was just horrible. But like I didn't do anything about it. Or I guess this is when my mom basically forced me to go to the doctor and get medicated on something. We kind of had like a family meeting where I just looked off into the distance and couldn't answer anything. She's just like, please let me like make an appointment for you. So it was just like, I was very agreeable because I didn't want to disagree with anybody. So I just let her do that. Went to the doctors, got put on Prozac, and I was on that for 2 weeks and it was actually making me feel worse. And then I went back to the doctors and I lied to my doctor because I wanted to commit suicide. So I didn't want the doctor to know how serious it was. So I told him it was making me feel a little bit better, but like not much, to be honest. And so what's the logical conclusion for him to do? It's to up the dosage. So he doubled the dosage on a medication that was making me feel worse already. So I got back and started taking that and just declined a lot. Had an experience where I was supposed to have a friend over and I ended up just like icing him out because I didn't want him to come over and find out how bad it was.
Right.
And that triggered a lot of things. I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't want anybody who might be struggling to get any like ideas, but basically I attempted, and I was only saved because my mom kind of got in the way, like right after I'd signed a suicide note. And thinking back now, like I can't fathom that was my past. It felt so real, and I was so isolated and alone back then that there was literally no hope. And like, yeah, what?
Oh, I was going to ask what the next step was for you. If you were on medication that was not helping and you were suicidal and kind of spiraling deeper and deeper into this dark, isolated place, how did that shift?
As soon as my mom walked up the stairs and found me just like sitting with like a note scattered around and just looking down, she'd like, what's going on? Are you going to like go see your friend? I said, no, I can't. And then I just started crying, and because I didn't know what to do, I wanted to like distract her from anything. Cause I kind of, before she was able to come all the way up the stairs, I like hid all of the equipment. And so right after that happened, she called the doctor and said, I don't know what's happening. Something's wrong with him. I think he just had like a huge panic attack. Something needs to change. Can we fix this medication? So my medication changed, put me onto Wellbutrin, which is the first medication in my entire life that's made me feel better. But it took a few days to kick in. And the only reason why I didn't like kill myself in those 2 months was because we were going on a family vacation. I was like, well, I'll give them that before I go.
Wow. Okay.
So I was feeling horrible like the first 5 days of family vacation. And then ironically, I was feeling better when I was in Death Valley National Park in Nevada. And I had one of those like the first moment that I like saw hope again was when we were in the middle of the night and I looked up in the national park and saw the most stars that I've ever seen in my life, and just like looking at them and like actually seeing hope. And that was the first time I had like a genuine like back and forth conversation like with my dad. And prior to that, for the past like 3 months, I wasn't capable of doing that. And it was just really cool.
So that's actually something that I want to touch upon is coping mechanisms. Something that was recommended to me by a friend, I believe, when I was in that like dark space, you know, because you don't want to connect and you want to be isolated, right? You don't want to make eye contact with people. I experienced also social anxiety. I remember she told me, she said, go outside and just connect with something. She was like, look at a leaf and notice it and touch it and connect with it, you know, and find this thing outside of yourself. So for you, it was the stars and it was this list for your friend.
Yeah.
But oftentimes it just takes that one little moment to notice something else. It can be, you know, a broken seam on your pants or whatever it is, something that's external that allows you to, you know, be in that moment with that thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's also a big part of a lot of what's helped me is mindfulness therapy and mindfulness meditation, because it's so focused on that. And I'm bringing you back to the moment and connecting with what's there rather than this cycle of thoughts that you have running through your brain.
Bipolar is like on somewhat of a spectrum, as like we can obviously tell between the two of us. Right. Like you have a very different bipolar than I do. But like there's lots of similarities and differences, but mine, with being so heavy on the depression, like I need medication because my natural disposition is not only depression, but like severe depression. And I didn't know that until like I had a manic episode.
Yeah.
So yeah, how was your experience with medication?
Yeah. I was on medication for a total of about just over 2 years, actually. And it's interesting you mentioned the, you know, balancing out the manic, because that's something that I know is a big issue with a lot of people who are medicated. Because if you only experience depression, it's a lot easier to put you on an upper and kind of balance you out that way. But that was something that came up with me is I actually went on Wellbutrin.
Oh, nice.
And it immediately, within a week, put me into a manic state.
Yeah.
So
does that.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was a long journey. I went on, I was put on Topiramate, which is a mood stabilizer. It's called Topamax. And the nickname for it is Dopamax because it makes you really stupid.
Dope.
I did not like that one. It really. Was
that a mood stabilizer?
It's a mood stabilizer. Okay, yeah. It kind of curbs all of your experience, and it was really difficult for my emotion, like my mental recall.
Those can have a lot of side effects, right?
Yes. And so I was on that, and then I also actually went on an anti-seizure medication as well.
Did you go on those at the same time, or did you do the anti-seizure?
Yeah, I went on both of them at the same time.
I feel like you should go on like one first and then add the other one.
I don't know. I think they were supposed to kind of balance one another out.
Did you have like one psychiatrist or multiple?
I had one.
Okay.
Yeah, I just had one woman that I went and saw. And so I was on lamotrigine, which is also an anti-seizure medication. And I actually spent a lot of time researching why people go on anti-seizure medication, because it is what's called an off-label prescription, which means that, you know, it's a seizure medication. So it's not something that's actually developed for psycho episodes. But what it does is that basically when you're, so what I understand of it is when you're having a seizure, your neurotransmitters are firing, you know, these electric signals to one another at an extremely fast rate.
Yeah. And
when you're having physical seizure, it's affecting your motor cortex part of your brain. And so all of your physical functions break down and cease. But when you're having a manic episode, your emotional centers are essentially experiencing the same thing. And that's what causes this roller coaster sensation of emotion, is that your neurotransmitters they've gone into overdrive and there's hyperactivity. And so they're just sending all of these impulses all the time, really erratically. And that's what creates a manic episode, basically.
Keep talking science to me.
Right. So that's what these medications are trying to curb. They're trying to bring you into the center. Yeah. And once I started, you know, researching that and understanding a little bit more of how the brain works, it made more sense to me.
Yeah.
And it also sort of validated what medication can do for people, because I grew up in Northern California. I was like really anti prescription medication. And then I started reading into it and, you know, found out that like you can actually have, if gone untreated, you can have really long-term damage to certain parts of your brain, especially the trauma and memory and anxiety centers, because you're constantly under stress. And your brain is
from the prescription?
No, from not being manic or depressed. Yeah, like sure. Your brain is experiencing stress when you're out of balance.
Yeah.
And so, and the other way that the brain works is that once grooves are formed, but like synaptical grooves are formed.
Man, synaptical grooves. Dude, that's a great band name.
Basically, once your brain is trained to send messages to itself in a certain way, those grooves get deeper and deeper and reinforced more commonly. So like if you're used to negative self-talk, that will just get stronger and stronger as you go, as you grow up, or like as you move on in life, if you don't deal with it. And so anyway, so I went on medication, and then but I was pretty determined to not stay on it. And so I really aggressively sought out talk therapy. And I saw two people. One of them was a mindfulness therapist coach. And then one was a cognitive behavioral therapist. CBT. I recommend this so strongly. It worked so well for me. And actually the way that CBT works is it essentially works to undo your negative thought patterns. So rather than continuing to reinforce that I hate myself things, you learn, positive reinforcement. And it can be a really big struggle to learn positive self-talk. I think for most people, it's hard for us to say, I love you. But that's what it does. It's supposed to retrain the brain on a very basic level.
And it's in like group sessions to be able to.
Mine was one-on-one, actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
The ones that I've experienced were in group sessions to be able to get more perspective from other people. And so I really appreciated that. But I guess
sounds awesome.
One-on-one would be helpful as well.
Yeah. And so that's what I did. That was my approach. I learned the neuroscience of what was happening and the chemical thing that was what was happening, and learned how to combat that. So I was on medication for 2 years, and then tapered off over the course of about 4 months, very slowly and very safely.
Never go straight off of medication. Always a bad thing. If you're ever considering it, don't. And always before going off medication, it has to be like alongside of your doctor.
Right. Right. And so I slowly tapered off. And actually what was the most effective thing for me, I think in conjunction with talk therapy, was I saw a acupuncturist and she did muscle testing. And so what muscle testing does is it basically goes through your system and establishes what your body is deficient in. And so I found out that my pituitary glands and my adrenal glands were fatigued and were essentially not producing the hormones that they needed to be. And that was part of what was throwing me so out of balance. And so I was then taking food supplements for that would bolster my adrenal glands and my pituitary system. And that balanced my entire system in a way that medication never did for me.
I feel like my off balance is just caused from like not having any external problems in life. And so I'm just like, I don't have any like actual problems. So like I have to have like internal problems to compensate for it.
Right.
And so I just I get all the, I feel in my mind, it's just like, no, you got no problems. So I'm just going to put all the problems in your head and make you like hate yourself for a while, and then you'll get over it.
Right. But like that's a big part of that is chemical imbalance.
Yeah, of course.
And so I learned all of these things about the different systems in the brain that function in these really interconnected ways that when one thing is out of balance, it can throw your entire system off. So I ended up going the route of supplements and of acupuncture. And that's been, long-term with talk therapy, that's been the most effective thing for me.
Yeah.
And I've been off medication now for almost a year.
Wow.
And it's been going well,
Cool.
But I also, the other thing that's really, I'm very aware of and that's very important for me is that I've learned what my limits are. Like I can't consume alcohol. Because alcohol is a
Any
trigger
alcohol
for me. Or whiskey.
Any hard alcohol.
I can consume a little, but if I drink a lot, the next week, inevitably I will experience a deep depression.
Really?
Because alcohol is a depressant. And it throws off the chemistry in your brain, and it triggers a lot of people.
Like it's highly recommended not to like use a lot of alcohol for bipolar and a lot of mental illnesses. Yeah,
and so that's something I've learned about myself. I also need a lot of sleep. I need regular sleep.
Yeah,
I need consistent exercise. Like there's certain things that I need to meditate. I've developed a meditation practice.
Nice.
There's certain things that I need to do. They're essentially non-negotiables in my life, is what I call them. Because without them, my whole system will fall apart. And it's been this really long process to allow myself that and to not feel guilty for it, and to recognize that I'm a little more sensitive than a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I have to prioritize my health. And, maybe I want to go out till 5 a.m. drinking some night, but I know that if I do that, my next 2 weeks are going to be shot. So I can't.
Yeah. Being bipolar, you have to be very aware of everything. Cause like having that, like you're forced to like be thinking about your emotions all the time. And like everybody who's bipolar is just a super emotional person, I bet.
Yeah.
Like I'm the most emotional like dude out there, I feel. But yeah. Is there anything else like surrounding medication? Because that's so interesting to me. Like I can't fathom going off my medication because I know where I was without it.
Right.
And like it being like a constant of depression, I need especially like norepinephrine levels to be raised by something. And like before, when I asked my doctor, do you think ever that I'll ever be able to go off of and before I would even finish the word medication, he's like, no. And I was like, all right, you studied, you went to college a lot, you had a lot of college, so I'll trust you.
Yeah. I think it's different for everybody.
Yeah,
Some
exactly.
people, like for me, it was definitely a short-term solution, and I needed it, and I'm grateful that I did it.
Yeah.
But even in the beginning, meeting with my psychologist, she approached it as a short-term solution.
Yeah. And it's a lifelong process. Like both of us, regardless of what we're taking and any mental illness, like you get used to certain medications and you'll have to adjust. And so sometimes you'll be more stressed out, so you might have to increase dosages, and sometimes you need less. It's a process and something that we have to deal with. And I would much rather deal with that than depression and hypomania. So I'm going to do that. Is there anything else that like you think that we didn't really hit on bipolar or that you want to talk about more? Because I feel like this has been pretty well so far. Pretty good.
I think so. Do we want to talk about?
Yeah, I want to, what is,
benefits?
The last question I want to ask you, what is the worst thing about having bipolar to you? Like, what's the most negative thing about having this mental illness?
I think for a while, it was the feeling of being out of control.
Yeah.
And not trusting myself.
Do you have that still?
No, I don't have that anymore because
Nice.
I've put in so many years of work, but especially when I was first diagnosed, I felt like I could no longer trust my thoughts. Like I'd lost agency and like I was experiencing all these things that were categorized as delusional, and that is the worst possible term to use because
it's so offensive.
Yeah. It's other people telling you that your experiences are not valid. And that was awful. That was really awful.
Is that said by like doctors or?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the technical term that they use is delusional when you're manic.
Yeah. It hurts. I'm feeling so much pain.
No, that's what it is. Manic
It's
behavior
true,
is
though.
delusional thoughts.
Oh, man.
Yeah, delusional means, not based
Dang
in
it.
reality. And it's true. Like
Yeah, it
if
is
you're
true.
having if you're experiencing like super negative thoughts and you think that someone is out to get you all the time, like that is a delusion.
Yeah, you trick yourself into thinking there's no hope. That's a delusion. And when you're manic, you trick yourself into thinking that like, I have this amazing idea planned out and there's nothing that's going to get in my way. That's why
you can buy a house.
Exactly. That's why like in a lot of things, like a lot of people go bankrupt because they'll go to a casino
it's
being
really common.
manic and they'll just lose all of their money because they feel in their mind that they're guaranteed to have it. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
I feel like the worst part about mine is probably about the same thing, but like not knowing, feeling like I don't know the difference between myself and who I am and what is the bipolar parts of my brain.
Yep.
And then not only that, but having to deal with people who know that I'm bipolar, who I'm just like subconsciously thinking that they're judging me for like, oh, he's being bipolar right now. This is because he's in a manic state. And I'm like, I'm feeling all of these things, like I'm overthinking absolutely everything. And then I'm like, is it? And because I think that they're thinking it, then is that true? And then if so, it's the worst of having to like overanalyze like every situation. And like just to combat that is just to remind yourself that like you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
That's the one thing that I want to hit home with this podcast and with any mental illness. I'll get into it later. We don't have enough of time to get into it now, but like it's not your fault to have a mental illness, but it is your fault if you don't fight it.
Or learn to live with it, manage it.
Exactly.
Fight is a very strong word, but I think
I'm a fighter. I'm a lover and a fighter.
Yeah, I think for me the word that works, or the term that works, is to embrace it.
yeah.
to learn about it, to accept it, to approach it with
you're
curiosity.
a kinder person than I am. I want to bite it. I want to kick its butt.
Well, that's what works for me. Is I don't want to feel like I'm fighting myself, but I definitely want to feel like I'm
yeah, maybe
approaching.
That sounds like a lot more healthy way to do it. I'll adjust.
Like,
I need to think
like
about that some more.
hugging myself internally, like forgiving yourself for it.
That's so good.
Yeah.
What
do you think? So I want to ask you, what do you think is the most positive component of being bipolar?
I would say being able to concentrate and just being able to like, because when I was I was depressed my whole life and I didn't know it. And like having everything flow and just like not having to worry about it is one of like my favorite things about it. And not only that, like getting into like the zone and the flow, but like it's basically like somebody has unlocked an emotional box and I can feel things. And being able to feel things and being an empathetic person is the most valuable thing that I think it's the most valuable characteristic and quality in my mind is to have empathy. And so it's like I had empathy before, but it's just increased that so much to be able to like have more normalized levels and even like just to have that understanding of other people. And being bipolar is cool too because we can understand people who are more anxious because we have to deal with the mania, and we can understand the depression side because we have that as well. And so just being a more empathetic, understanding person is probably the best thing about it. Like I love being bipolar, and I never thought that like I'd say that initially, but it's pretty great. What about you?
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think for me, it's empathy, definitely. But also, I mean, I think it is a benefit to experience such a range of human emotion.
Yeah.
You know, I come from an acting background. So for me, I used that experience as a tool. Like everything that I experienced was then part of how I could interpret a character and how I could
channel that now.
Yeah. So there's that. And there's also just my creativity has been, I'm an artist, and all of that is, I think, attributed to the fact that I experience and feel things so deeply.
Yeah. I find it so interesting that like every person who's like super creative tends to have some type of mental illness. It seems.
Yeah. I mean,
I feel like, we should do an episode about that eventually. But
creativity and mental illness, definitely.
She's a super talented musician and creative, and I do a lot of things, and now I'm getting more passionate about podcasts and just we're getting involved in all the mediums. So yeah. All right. I think that's a good place to end the episode. So thank you for tuning in to episode 1. We've got to not give me a high five.
Woo-hoo!
Yes. All right. Oh, that was a good sound. Stay tuned. In a couple weeks, we will have a brand new episode for you. So subscribe to the podcast, give it a review if you want, and support us on Patreon. You got anything else?
Yeah. Also online on the podcast website, we will have resources so you can check out a little bit more about each of the topics that we cover during the episodes.
MrFeelsPodcast.com. Check it out. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Probably don't end it. We're going to take